I was speaking last night in Manassas. I had a great group there. Good conservative Tea Party folks. Shaq was there. Good group of people. And regarding what needs to be done in the Senate this week, I laid out a simple strategy for what absolutely they need to do. I touched on this when I was guest hosting my friend Sean Hannity's radio show last Friday. And so anyway, some people came up and said, you need to do a video and put it up on the web so people can see, here's what we need to be demanding of the Senate. So let me just spell that out. First of all, the House was on course this week to vote to disapprove the Iran deal under the Corker-Cardin bill. The Corker-Cardin bill does not apply to the Iranian treaty that this administration is negotiating. It doesn't. And what was going to happen, according to what Mitch McConnell and John Boehner agreed, the House was going to take this vote to disapprove under Corker-Cardin. We were going to get 2/3 to vote to disapprove the agreement. And then under Corker-Cardin, the Senate would take a vote. And we had already heard they're not going to have 2/3 to disapprove. Therefore, under the Corker-Cardin bill, the Iran treaty, and I'm calling it a treaty because that's what it is no matter what the administration calls it, the Iran treaty would go into effect because the House and Senate did not vote 2/3 to stop it, which basically turns the thing called the U.S. Constitution upside down. So we were told at our conference this past week, all the Republican members, that that's what was going to happen, and a strange thing happened. On Wednesday, when we were supposed to vote on the rule at 1:30, we had that vote called off because enough people notified the speaker what I stood up and said in conference, and that is, I can't vote for this rule. This is the prescription for allowing the Iran agreement to go into effect fully, and it's wrong for us to do this. Anyway, I knew how Dave Bratt felt. We get together at the first of each week, talk about what's coming up. But before the 1:30 vote, it was called off. And then because a bunch of our members told the speaker, look, this is an embarrassment, let's get together and have a conference. We had a conference at 4:00 in the afternoon, and we came to an agreement after a conference. It wasn't the best thing we could have done, but it was an acceptable thing that we did. And that was, we voted to say the Corker-Cardin timeline had not kicked in yet, which was true because the administration had not provided all the information about the Iran agreement. That's true. And I'm emphasized on the floor Thursday and Friday, but the important thing to understand, some say, well, it doesn't really matter that we don't know what the IAEA agreements are with Iran, but there are places in the Iranian agreement that this administration negotiated that only part of the provision is being mentioned to the public. And I keep bringing it up because I'm not hearing anybody else talk about it. But as a former judge, when I see the little two-letter word, or, that disjunctive little word, then it gets my attention. Another word that gets my attention is if. Those little words can cause a lot of trouble. And if you see those, you zero in, whoa, wait a minute, or what? Well, there are provisions that say, for example, on sanctions, ICBMs, 8-year prohibition or until the IAEA states the broader conclusion, and I can't find what the heck the broader conclusion is, the broader conclusion that the Iranian nuclear material is being used for peaceful purposes. Now, I haven't heard a representative of the IAEA say that, but I've heard on the news this summer that the IAEA has said, as far as we know, the Iranian nuclear material is being used for peaceful purposes. But when a few of us, for instance, Steve King, Dan Rohrbach, and I met with IAEA, the two lead representatives, investigators for the country of Iran, we met with them, and they were saying, yeah, well, as far as we know, they're using it for peaceful purposes, but we're only allowed to inspect or look at certain facilities, and we hadn't been able to look at the military facilities for a very long time. And that's still going to be the case under this deal. And so it's important to know what that agreement is, because it could mean that that 8 years and those provisions I mentioned are actually 0 years. It could be now. All this stuff about, well, it'll be 8 years, it'll be 10 years. Wait a minute. Let's find out what's in the outside agreements, because it may not be years at all. We may be talking about the moment the deal is signed. So it is critical to this agreement. It does go to the crux of it. So anyway, we had enough of an uprising that we voted first to say they hadn't complied with the requirements of Corker Card, and therefore the 60-day timeline in it had not started. And then, because the Corker-Cardin bill required a vote to disapprove, we didn't want the appearance that we were taking a vote under the Corker bill, so we voted to approve, to make clear it's not under the Corker bill, and knowing that that would fail miserably, which it did. And then we voted to not have the sanctions, anything done with the sanctions until January, and give a chance to further be reviewed. So that's what we voted on. It would have been, I think, preferable just to say Corker-Cardin doesn't apply. This is a treaty and it requires 2/3 of the Senate to ratify it. But with what we did, it's okay in the House. And people coming out for the rally like some of you guys did, people that notified their representative, it made a difference. We went from having the votes to do what Boehner wanted to, that was going to allow the Iranian deal to go into effect, to having the vote that said it's not going into effect. But what it comes back to is the Iranian deal is a treaty. And under Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, the president, it says he, the president, shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. That's how you ratify a treaty. That's what kicks it in and makes it enforceable against the United States. There's no other way to make a treaty enforceable against the United States other than that in Article 2. The danger is if the Senate takes up the vote to disapprove under the Corker-Cardin bill, then the president will be able to say, yes, Congress had the authority to have 2/3 ratify this treaty, but Congress decided that that would be manifested if both the House and the Senate didn't come up with 2/3 to disapprove it. They didn't, and therefore this treaty goes into effect, and we are bound. And then the unthinkable. I really doubt I'd like to see a hand if you ever saw this coming in your lifetime before this year. The scenario will be Israel has to defend themselves against Iranian's nuclear threat. And the Iranian treaty this administration has negotiated is deemed in effect, and therefore we have to defend the people with whom we have an agreement, Iran, against the attack by the warmongering Israel. I mean, did anybody ever think before this year that might possibly happen?
Yeah.
A few of you did. I've just never seen that could be possible. I just didn't see it, not in my lifetime. We would never be on the opposite side of Israel. We disagreed over some things. There have been incidents over the years, but not to be on the side of the biggest supporter of terrorism in the world against the one real true democracy in that area. Unbelievable. What the Senate needs to do is say the Corker bill does not apply here for a number of reasons. For one thing, you can't modify a treaty with anything but a treaty. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty is modified by the Iran deal a number of ways. You can't do that unless you do it with a treaty. So it is a treaty. It would take a treaty to make new agreements with regards to the arms embargo on Iran. That will take a treaty. It will take a treaty to do anything with regard to ICBMs with regard to Iran. For a number of reasons, the Iranian agreement is a treaty. Now, I read you what the Constitution says about how a treaty is ratified. The President can negotiate them, but the Senate has to ratify them. Well, the Senate, some in the Senate say, look, under our procedure, the President has to submit a treaty to the Senate, and then we have a ratification vote on it. That's how it works. Folks, that's not a constitutional requirement. And when it's not a constitutional requirement, then the Senate can do what Harry Reid did over and over and over, and that is suspend the rules for this occasion, and with specific regard to cloture. Harry Reid suspended cloture for a bunch of confirmations. And this is what the Republican leader in the Senate should do. Proclaim this is a treaty. And the President hasn't submitted it, but that's not required under the Constitution. All that's required is that we have a ratification vote. And just like Harry Reid suspended cloture for many of the confirmation votes, we're going to suspend it for one, and the reason is this. We're not going to allow a handful of Democrats to prevent the Senate from voting on the most important vote that we will have in our time in Senate. We're not going to let that happen. So you have a vote on suspending the cloture rule and any other Senate rule that would stop it procedurally. It'd take 51 votes to do that. And then you bring to the Senate floor, for however long they care to debate it, you bring this treaty to the Senate floor for a vote on ratification. Now, you heard the Constitution requires 2/3 to ratify. They're bragging when they got to 34. We can stop this. We have 34 that support it. Well, that's not good enough under our United States Constitution, and our Republican leader in the Senate needs to say that. We're taking a vote on ratification of this treaty, and if it doesn't get 2/3, it can never be enforced in a United States court or in any court around the world, because we have not ratified it in our country and we cannot be bound by it. That needs to happen. It can happen. Some said there's nothing you can do to stop the vote that's going to take place in the House under the Corker bill. Well, guess what happened this week? It was stopped. You know, you participated. You helped make that happen. You can make this happened with the Senate, that they follow the Constitution this week. Wouldn't that be